Welcome to Cannabis 360, your source for cannabis and psychedelic industry news, interviews, and insights. Visit canna360.ca and sign up to receive free access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog. In this episode of High Fidelity, we speak with Anthony Carnevale, co-founder of the Canadian Cannabis Tourism Alliance. Anthony discusses current initiatives that the CCTA is working on, the different models of cannabis tourism, including consumption lounges, and how he sees the cannabis tourism market developing over the next few years in Canada.
Hey, hi, Anthony. How are you today?
Good, man. Doing great. How about you?
Doing well. Thank you for asking. Really excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Cool. So really excited to talk to you about the future of cannabis tourism in Canada and sort of where we are with that currently. But first off, I think you have a really interesting story, and I always like to ask people sort of how they got into the cannabis industry in the first place. So can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into the space?
Yeah, so I've always been a cannabis lover since I was probably 14, 15 years old. But I started my career in the wine industry. I worked in the wine industry for about 10 years. I studied wine. I studied hospitality and restaurant management as well. And my focus was always to like transition it over to cannabis. But before it was legal, I really didn't see any career trajectory. I always kind of hustled on the side, but it wasn't like I wasn't making a living off of it or anything. So as soon as legalization hit, I basically spent my entire youth hanging out at this cannabis lounge called Vapor Central. And I was working at this wine job, and it was like my first like real job. And I was making good money and hating my life. And I would just come to the bar. I would come to the lounge every night and just complain about my job, complain about my job, complain about my job. And then one day the GM there was like, well, if you want to work here, you can. And I was like, really? So I applied, I ended up getting the job, and in the 2 years I was there, I kind of moved up into general manager of the lounge. And that's kind of how I got my start in cannabis tourism, running a cannabis lounge here in the city, Toronto.
That's awesome. Yeah, the legendary Vapor Central, of course, was definitely sad to see that shut down, unfortunately. Now, you also did like a bong cleaning kind of service. And are you still doing that?
Yeah, I'm still doing that. So that came after the lounge, actually. So when the pandemic hit, we were forced to close our doors. And I kind of went from up here, like working my dream job, just like felt like everything had clicked, to just overnight, everything was gone, right? So I fell into a pretty deep depression that summer, and I just needed something to do. I couldn't sit at home and just do nothing. From going from working 100 hours a week to waking up at 3:00, 7 days a week. It was pretty bad. So I put out this post kind of out of desperation saying, does anybody want me to come clean their bong? I'd been doing that a lot at the lounge. At the end of the night, sometimes I'd have to clean 30 bongs in an hour or something. So I was like, I can do this. I know there's an isopropyl alcohol shortage, and I could figure out a better way to make this happen. So I put out the post. I got 6 responses in the first day, and I was like, oh, I'm onto something. So here I am 2 years later, almost. I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary of it. But it's been a real journey. It's opened a lot of doors for me. And yeah, we're cleaning bongs, rigs, vaporizers, pipes, crop trimming equipment, whatever you have that's got cannabis stains or resin on it, we do it.
That's awesome. So you became a master at it just from repetitive, end of night, trying to be efficient, I guess, right?
It took me a while to like get this confident about it, because people were always jumping down my throat, like, oh, anybody could clean a bong. But like, I'm very confident to say I'm the best bong cleaner in the world now. Like I could do anything. Like a lot of the pieces I clean aren't your standard, like just regular 2 days use, need to scrub down with some ISO. Like I could clean a 5-perk piece that's been used for years and get it done fast.
A Zong.
Zong was actually one of my first customers, because Zongs are problematic.
They're tough,
especially if you smoke batch out of them. So anybody who's still smoking tobacco, I could tell you for sure it's terrible for your lungs, because it's way harder to clean out of bongs. So,
definitely. Okay, so going in now to the Canadian Cannabis Tourism Alliance, or CCTA for short. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, how did that come to be? I think it's a relatively new initiative, right?
Mhm.
And what are some of the things you're working on with that?
Yeah, for sure. So we just formed at the beginning of the year. We're a professional alliance of various businesses who are either invested in the current tourism landscape or cannabis, right? And trying to bring those two together, um, and make Canada a welcoming place for, Canna curious around the world, and in particular the Canna lovers around the world. So the group is just forming. We've taken in a pretty good amount of membership so far. We're actually tonight, we're going to have our first general meeting, right? It'll be the first time we all kind of come together on a conference call. But exciting movement happening there is like we're talking very closely with government, and it does seem like both the Ontario and the federal government are interested in giving us some grant money and helping to invest into better understanding this cannabis tourism idea, right? Because we talk to a lot of politicians, and a lot of them are like, "That sounds cool," but they don't have a clue what we're talking about, right? So yeah, we could get into a bit of what that entails, like cannabis tourism, right?
Yeah, because I'm interested in that. So really good to hear that government is interested at least, and they're willing to have that conversation. But I think you bring up something interesting, which is sort of that education component, right? And so yeah, what does that look like when you're talking to politicians, when you're talking to government? So what are sort of those missing pieces that needs to be maybe explained a little bit more in depth to them?
Well, so right now, we've gotten to a stage where they get what we're saying. People come here, they know it's a federally legal place. They want to be able to consume cannabis, and they don't want to jump through a million hoops to get it. And they want we want to make it so that it's easy for people coming to Canada to buy cannabis and consume it, right? That's the real part that seems to be missing in the legislation right now, is like if you visit Toronto, you'll have no trouble finding weed, right? But then once you buy it and you're from a place where it's illegal, most people aren't going to feel comfortable just smoking on the street, right? They're like, oh, well, okay, now we have the weed. Where do we go? Right. And it's like, well, you could go to that park over there, but don't go near the kids over there. And this is a school zone, and there's a cop station over there. And it's like, just offering them an environment where it's conducive to using cannabis, not just purchasing it. And so basically, like when we started speaking with the government, it was mostly just telling them that this is something people want, right? A lot of people we spoke to said, I don't think people want this, right? But we kept hitting them up. We kept showing them examples of things that are happening in the States, because it's unfortunate, but like we're federally legal here, but every state that legalizes seems to be moving light years faster than us in terms of this consumption area, right? LA has lounges, New York's opening lounges, every state's opening lounges, Colorado has lounges, but no lounges here. So, now we're in a phase where they're like, okay, we see potential, but we don't know how big this could be, or, what does this mean for? Because really what they're trying to do from the government's angle is like the tourism industry has been decimated by the pandemic, right? So they're looking for any opportunity to differentiate Canada as a destination for international travel. And then, there's a large element of domestic travel that's included in this, right? Like people visiting from Kitchener to Toronto to enjoy our cannabis scene. That used to happen a lot when we had Vapor Central, when we had Hotbox, when we had a lot, like a large lounge scene here. People would come in from out of town specifically to hang out at these lounges, right? And then they come, they consume, they go to restaurants in the area, they might check out a movie, right? It's a big tourism boom that we see. And now we're just trying to quantify that. Yeah.
That's interesting. So I think you bring up a really interesting point too, in terms of like that stigma can still exist, especially if you're coming from a place where it's illegal, right? So, even though in, most like municipalities, at least here in Ontario, like you can pretty much consume cannabis anywhere where you can consume a cigarette, basically is essentially the rule. But that's not the case across Canada though, right? Like a lot of provinces have restricted it to private residences. So makes it even more sort of needed in terms of those consumption spaces, right? Especially in those areas. But it brings up a good point too. Even areas that we do have, public consumption laws that are, technically allowed, that stigma still might be there, right? So,
and I'm going to be honest, like, I think we're in a place now where people have been so used to it being illegal and not having these lounges, right? But imagine a future 10 years from now where there's a lounge on every corner. If you were smoking a joint on the street, you'd be looked at the same way that you're looked at drinking a beer or chugging out of a 2-6 on the street, right? Like people are like, there's bars for that. Like my kids are here. Like, what are you doing? Right? Get this off the street. Nobody has a problem with you drinking, but they don't necessarily want you to be doing it in front of them, in front of their business, right? In front of their school, in front of their house. Right. So that's the other element of this is like people who are not friendly to cannabis should be embracing this wholeheartedly.
yeah,
It gets the stoners out of their face. Right. It's like,
it's a really good point.
go do it in your place and we can stay over here. Right. And it's, yeah, it seems like a no-brainer, right? But like when it comes to government stuff, they do want to see numbers. They want to understand, they want to make sure they're doing this safely. And that's super important to us too. Right.
Yeah, and I definitely relate to that. Like if I'm on the street, smoking a joint and I'm around, parents and kids and that sort of thing. Like, I mean, there is the secondhand smoke element to it, right? Whether it's cannabis or a cigarette, like, and I can definitely see that being a bit of a nuisance to some people, right? And I understand that perspective. So, so I think that's a really good point. It's like bringing those people into the fold a little bit. Like this is a win for you too, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really strong point there. Now, in terms of the sort of kind of current state of cannabis tourism in Canada, like are we seeing any sort of examples of this yet? Like, are there more and more companies, trying to cater to tourists, or are we still just really in the early stages of this? Like again, what is sort of like the current state of cannabis tourism in Canada? Are we still like really, really behind, or are we starting to see a bit of progress happening on this front?
I would say we're behind considering we're so far ahead in so many other aspects of this cannabis stuff. But what I've really thought has been interesting about this thing is like we're in a place now where there's no regulation, but things are still happening. Right. Versus like before legalization, there was no regulations and things were happening. Versus like now, there are retail stores offering smoking in their patios in the back, right? Which isn't technically allowed. I'm all for it, right? Like I'm all for anybody trying to improve consumption because like we said, this stigma and the normalizing of like consuming safely in a group social setting is super important. But really the state of cannabis tourism right now is where cannabis was in maybe 2015, 2014. Right? Where it's like, people are doing it, but it's like, you don't want the authorities to show up kind of thing. Right. So I'm very excited that at the X this year, they're making a public kind of push. There's a consumption lounge there. There's a lot of uncertainty around what exactly they talk a lot about compliance, and I'm very familiar with this area. So I'm very interested to know how they're complying. Again, I do support the act of consumption, right? I do support the lounges, but this is why the government needs to move on this. It needs to be a level playing field where everybody knows what the rules are, what's allowed, what's not allowed, right? So that we can bring investment in, right? I'd love to run a lounge right now. I don't know necessarily how many investors are going to be chomping at the bit to like jump into something like this when it's so uncertain what the future might bring, right? And then we also have to really separate like consumption into smoking and non-smoking consumption, right? Because I think that edibles lounges, beverages lounges, restaurants that serve THC infused foods will probably show up years before we create a smoking lounge, in particular indoors. But in my humble opinion, I think the smoking lounge, it's I'm a bit biased because I ran a smoking lounge, but I think the smoking lounges are the most important element of this because number one, most consumers' preferred method is either smoking or vaping. Number two, we live in a country where 50% of the year is too cold outside to be consuming cannabis socially. You know what I mean? Like it's such a big opportunity versus like the edibles thing. I could see regular restaurants being allowed to serve edibles or whatever, but you'll never get that smoking element into the current. And whether smoking will be allowed is still TBD, right? Like I think vaping is going to be a lot easier of a case to make. I wonder about smoking. I wonder about blunts, like tobacco blunts and stuff. Where will there be cigar lounges of cannabis, right? Where like that's where you go to smoke blunts, right? Will there be smoking lounges? Will there be vapor lounges? Will there be just the 510 thread lounges? Like what? There's room for so much, the way the bars are in Toronto, there's a bar for everybody. There's a bar for every type of culture, subculture, whatever, right? And I'd like to see a future where and I think everybody else in the CCTA would like to see a future where that's possible in cannabis. There's also this cool wellness aspect, right? And like this wellness tourism, like people could travel here and smoke weed and do yoga. And, that's a different conversation than people who are coming here to smoke weed and try to get as high as they can in a lounge ripping dabs all day, right? Both are acceptable, right? You're not going to have the negative impact of somebody drinking, heavily all day, right? But they both have different needs and they're both going to have probably different regulations around them too.
Yeah, I think the key point that you just mentioned there. So yeah, I heard that story with the lounge at the X, and it is interesting. And what I thought it was interesting as well, I just saw CanCell send out a promotion today, like mentioning it actually, and sort of promoting it. So, but I think like the point that you bring up that is really critical here is like there needs to be clarity, right, on these rules, so that it's
transparency throughout.
Yeah, so it's a level.
I'm trying to raise money, and I how can I go to investors saying this is what I'm going to do when there's somebody in the CBC with a news article about how they've created this compliant lounge and the only way that I know around the Smoke Free Ontario Act right now is to be a research facility, a hospice, or a private residence. That's the only ways that I have interpreted the laws, right? So if they are running a research lounge, which is the way we did things back at Vapor Central, I'm all for it. But I don't know how political you want me to get, but I do think that the retail rollout was done in an incredibly unfair and unreasonable way. And I would hope we've learned from that and it won't be retail 2.0 when lounges roll out. But TBD.
Yeah, I mean, the lottery was I think a traumatic time for a lot of people, right? Like it was really rough, the rollout of that. So I completely agree with you. It was an absolute mess when that happened. But you touched on it a little bit there, and I kind of want to dive into some of like the different models that are out there, right? Because I think when people think cannabis tourism, I think the first thing that people think about generally tends to be sort of like a wine tour type of model, right? What I like about your perspective is that you sort of touch on these other kind of different aspects to it as well. So like consumption lounges. So what are some of the different models that you're seeing? Like, are there any like really like unique approaches that, maybe companies are thinking about or are planning or have in the works that, maybe most people don't think about when they think about cannabis tourism?
Yeah, for sure. Like let's just like, this is kind of tourism 101, but like tourism starts with the transportation industry, right? That's like the heartbeat of tourism. And then it breaks off into all these things, right? There's business tourism, there's leisure tourism, and then there's friends and family tourism. And then within those, there's so many elements. There's lodging, so hotels, there's restaurants, there's events, conferences. One of the things that I thought was really cool right when legalization happened and they were operating in a bit of an unlicensed way was there was a golf course that opened out near Smith Falls called the Rolling Greens, right? And like, I don't know what the demand would be for something like that, but a guy like me would love, I don't even like golf, but I would go to a golf course that I knew everybody was like me, right? Maybe part of the reason I don't like golf is because it's stuffy, right? And if there were more people like me there, I'd like it more, right? So I think that was a really cool thing. I'd love to see movie theaters with like a vaporizer attached to your seat. Like
Love that.
that would be so cool, you know? So I don't have to do like edibles before going into the movie, and it's like a Russian roulette with the rest of my night. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I thought the Rolling Greens thing was really cool. I think stuff around this wellness thing will be cool. And I think like, yeah, like it's funny when I talk about tourism, people, their first thing their head goes to is like their vacation travels. And it's like tourism, the business side of tourism is so much bigger than vacations, right? Like guys are traveling for conferences all the time, and you know, every hotel has a bar for that very reason. How do we get cannabis into the fold here? How do we start curing some hangovers and, you know, showing people a different way? Because I think the business traveler is a huge opportunity for cannabis on a whole, right? And if we want to be the country, like the cannabis country, right, and exporting and, you know, creating an international trade of this, then we need to have business leaders from around the world seeing that how it works. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, definitely helps answer that question. And yeah, I love the idea of I'm a big movie buff myself. And yeah, definitely something like, you know, prior to the movie, you're kind of like showing up 20 minutes early and, you know, smoking the joint before you go in and that sort of thing. So yeah, something where it's, you know, built into the theater experience would be, I would love that. Absolutely. Now, you kind of touched on it a little bit already, but let's dive in maybe a little bit deeper into like, what are the challenges you've seen? So I love the fact that, you know, you're talking to government, you're having those conversations, but what do you really see at the moment that's holding sort of Canada back from becoming a leader in the space? Because, you know, you've seen Amsterdam, I mean, even with their sort of pseudo legalization there.
So Amsterdam's pulling back.
Yeah.
Which is why we have such a big opportunity.
Yeah.
Such a big opportunity, right? Like, the States seems to be going to hell in a handbasket, right? And like an international traveler who wants to smoke cannabis, like, you know, LA is still a great tourism destination, but I think Canada, if we marketed it properly, if we, you know, use Destination Canada or Destination Cannabis or something, and really promoted it as the place you come and try this new thing that's been illegal around the world for 100 years. I see a lot of opportunity in that. It's funny, if you'd asked me about the biggest problems we faced 3 months ago, I would have said government, but I think they're quickly real, you know, I think they had a lot to deal with the pandemic, right? There were actually on the municipal level, they were consulting people about cannabis lounges right before the pandemic started. And then the pandemic basically cut the head off of tourism altogether, right? So I think now that they're finally moving out of that and they're, you know, getting rid of the mandates for travel, like obviously all the travel mandates around Canada are problematic for cannabis tourism because it's going to be like such a small part of tourism on a whole. And if everybody's hurting, right? But I think now that the government is moving out of this pandemic stage, they're starting to look for new opportunities to boost our economy in unique ways, right? And that's why we're seeing so much support, both on provincial and federal levels, right? So, biggest issues we face right now. I feel very positive about it. I would say, you know, I'd obviously love to see laws move a little faster, but yeah, CCTA is working hard for everybody, and I would hope that in 6 months' time we have a good, you know, have some money and put some research together about how big this can be, right? And start to bring in real investment money.
Yeah. And that marketing piece, right? I think that's really interesting as well. Like really kind of pushing the message out there that like this is an industry that we support and encourage people to take part in. I think that's huge. And then I think, like you said, too, clarity, right? On a lot of these things. I think, hopefully what we're seeing happening at the X is sort of the first step towards, this becoming something like across the board that retailers or even independents can and not necessarily sell cannabis, but again, have some type of consumption lounge or space. So hopefully that really starts to move the needle forward. But I think you're right. Like, I think it is. Like, I think there is more hope and more kind of conversation happening around cannabis tourism than there ever was, really. Like, I'm starting to see it more and more now, it feels, as sort of a dialogue is happening. So that's great to see.
Yeah, the dialogue is great. And I don't know, like maybe the pandemic, there was so much weed smoked over the pandemic. I think it did help with the stigma to a certain extent. Like I think a lot of even people who wouldn't have necessarily been into weed were like, I'm at home. I've been at home for the last 3 months. I can order weed to my house. I might as well try.
Yeah.
Right. This normalization thing is so interesting. I thought it would happen a lot faster. Maybe I was just I don't know, foolish or something, but it was like right after legalization, I was like, yeah, everybody's gonna welcome weed now. Right. And I think we're finally getting to a point where you don't have people hating on weed. Or it would be weird too.
Yeah.
Maybe I have a little bit of bias because of the circles I roll in, but like I go to family functions now and people are asking me about it, right? Like they're not, like it's so weird, right? Like people that, like, my mom would have died if they knew I smoked weed 10 years ago, right? Like they're asking me, oh, I hear you work in this, can I help with this? Can I help with that? Right. And that's why I bring up that wellness aspect. Like, think about these boomers, like, they're all retiring and they're all, gonna start getting ailments. That's part of getting old, right? Why can't they have a social place to go and enjoy the wellness benefits of cannabis, right? Like, you can't even go do that with CBD right now, right? Like just a cafe with CBD.
Yeah, I'm with you on that 100%. I'm like my aunts too. I totally relate to that. Like coming at me, like asking about CBD, asking about cannabis oil, and that sort of thing. And five years ago, it was like I was shunned for walking out, like at like the dinner, what I mean, afterwards and that sort of thing, and leaving with a few of the cousins to go get high. That was always sort of shunned. And I think in some ways, like that is still sort of there, but you're right. Like it's slowly eroding, right? Which is great. Now, I know it's always hard to, predict the future, right? But where do you sort of see like cannabis tourism over the next, 2, 3, maybe even 5 years? Like where do you hope we are over that period of time? And I think you kind of mentioned some of that already, but yeah, just like what are your hopes for the industry over the next few years?
2 years. 2 years is a pretty short time frame. I think probably in 2 years we'll have at least some regulation around the serving of edibles or infused foods, whether that is in restaurants or private dinners. There will be rules around that. We've seen great movement in Alberta in terms of festivals where you can get weed delivered to a festival now. I'd like to see at festivals that you can actually purchase the weed at the festival, consume it, maybe have a consumption space so that not everybody has to smell the weed. I really do think that this is a 5-year time frame though, like at least to bring smoking, like my passion, like smoking vaporizer lounges. I see that being about 5 years out, and there will still be this kind of underground stuff happening up until that point. And then honestly, in 10 years, or 5 to 10 years, I would really like to see the CCTA, achieve its goals of helping facilitate this. And then we kind of transition into a destination marketing organization. And we become the destination Canada of cannabis, right?
Yeah.
Where we're reaching out to places like Jamaica, Spain, places that we know have, their own vibrant cannabis communities, and be like, come over, see what we have, take it home and learn from us, right? Like we should be showing people how things are done, not the like it seems crazy to me that we're 4 years into legalization and we have to go find data from lounges in the States to explain why this is going to be a thing here. But yeah.
No, I like that. And, you know, it's interesting because I think in cannabis, like you said, you know, 3 months ago, you would probably just been saying government, and that would be your sort of biggest complaint. But it's interesting how the tables turn. And, you know, in cannabis, we do complain a lot about the regulations, but this is a really good example of sort of the CCTA kind of running towards the regulations, right? Asking for regulations, asking for clarity on rules, right? And so I think that's something that should be welcomed. And it's really important. So I'm really glad to hear that you guys are having your first meeting. Good luck in that meeting.
Yeah.
And where is the best place for people to find you? I know you're really active on LinkedIn. I love the insight that you share on LinkedIn. So definitely go look for Anthony there. But anywhere else that people can find you?
We're still building out the CCTA's website. We'll probably keep most of the marketing related to CCTA on LinkedIn because it is a professional organization. We're going to be making an Instagram account as well by the end of the week, but I don't anticipate there will be a lot of activity on the Instagram account because Instagram is not friendly to cannabis, and well, shooting yourself in the foot sometimes.
Yeah. So, well, we'll link down below the CCTA website. And then also too, definitely highly recommend checking out Anthony over on LinkedIn. Like I said, he's always sharing some great insight on there. But thank you for being with us today, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Connor.
Have a great day.
Bye, man.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of High Fidelity. For access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog, subscribe at canna360.ca or visit our YouTube channel, Canna360.